It was the summer of 1987, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, and feeling invincible. That was the year I decided to hike part of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, solo. It was supposed to be my big adventure before starting a desk job at a marketing firm in Richmond. I packed my olive green JanSport backpack, laced up my new Reebok sneakers, and hit the road in my mom's powder blue Buick LeSabre. Shenandoah National Park was just a couple hours away, and I couldn't wait to lose myself in nature. I left my Walkman and mixtape at home, wanting to fully immerse myself in the wilderness. I wasn't some granola type or anything, but I wanted this to feel raw and real. No distractions, just me and the trail. I parked the LeSabre near the Skyland Lodge. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a beat-up brown Chevy truck with a Reagan Bush 84 bumper sticker. It felt like a good sign. Quiet, peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I checked my gear, locked the car, and set off. The air smelled earthy and fresh, the kind of smell that makes you feel alive. Birds chirped overhead, and the crunch of my steps on the gravel trail felt oddly satisfying. The first few hours were uneventful. I passed a couple of hikers coming the opposite direction, older guys with heavy packs and plaid shirts. We exchanged nods, and they gave me the usual advice: stay hydrated, don't stray off the trail. Simple enough. The deeper I got into the woods, the quieter it became. That's one thing you don't think about when you hike alone, how the silence can press down on you. It wasn't eerie at first, just peaceful. I stopped for lunch near a small creek, pulling out my peanut butter and jelly sandwich from a brown paper bag. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, insects, were gone. It was like someone had hit the mute button. I brushed it off. Maybe the animals were just shy, or maybe I wasn't paying attention. I packed up my stuff and kept walking, but the silence stayed with me. About 3 miles in, I reached a stretch of trail where the trees grew thick and tall, their branches knitting together overhead. It was darker here, almost like twilight, even though it was barely past noon. That's when I noticed it, the shadow. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The light was weird in that part of the forest, and shadows were everywhere. But this one was different. It moved. I stopped in my tracks and squinted down the trail. About 50 feet ahead, something darted behind a tree. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a deer, too tall. It wasn't a bear, too thin. And it definitely wasn't another hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light, and kept walking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, cone the back, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I reached a small wooden shelter about 5 miles in, I was completely unnerved. The shelter was basic, just a roof and 3 walls with a wooden platform for sleeping. I decided to take a break and figure out what to do. The shadow thing, or whatever it was, hadn't followed me inside. At least, I didn't think it had. I pulled out my canteen and took a long drink, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I noticed the carvings. They covered the wooden walls of the shelter, some of them old and faded, others fresh. Most were harmless, initials, dates, little hearts. But one carving stood out. It read, "Don't stay after dark." I laughed nervously, but it wasn't funny. The words looked fresh, the edges of the letters still rough. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the jagged grooves in the wood. Someone had carved this recently, maybe within the last few days. I decided I wouldn't take any chances. I'd head back to the car before nightfall. It was only early afternoon, and I had plenty of time. I stuffed my things back into my backpack and stepped outside. That's when I saw it again. The shadow. This time, it wasn't darting behind a tree. It was standing there in the middle of the trail, about 30 feet away. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and vaguely human-shaped, but wrong. Its arms were too long, its movements too jerky, like an old stop-motion animation. And its face, if it had one, was hidden in the darkness. I froze, my mind racing. Run? Scream? Pretend I didn't see it? The thing tilted its head, like it was studying me. Then it took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted down the trail, my legs pumping, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest blurred around me as I ran, branches whipping at my arms and face. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail looked unfamiliar, and there were no markers in sight. Panic set in. I'd gotten turned around, probably when I was running. My compass was useless. I didn't know which direction would lead me back to the car. The light was starting to fade now, and I knew I had to move fast. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every so often, I'd hear a soft rustling behind me, like someone, or something, was following. By the time I stumbled onto a dirt road, the sun was setting. I nearly cried with relief when I saw headlights in the distance. A rusty old pickup truck pulled up, its engine rattling like it might fall apart any second. The driver was an older man in a flannel shirt, chewing on a toothpick. "You lost, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, too out of breath to speak. He let me climb into the passenger seat, and I practically collapsed onto the cracked vinyl seat. The truck smelled like gasoline and sawdust, but I didn't care. I was safe. As he drove me back to the Skyland parking lot, I told him what happened. I expected him to laugh, maybe tell me I was imagining things, but he didn't. Instead, he glanced at me, his face grim. "You ain't the first to see something out there," he said, "and you won't be the last. Best stick to daylight if you're hiking these parts." When we pulled into the parking lot, I thanked him and hurried to my car. The Le Sabre started on the first try, and I peeled out of there, not even stopping to change out of my sweaty clothes. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods. A trick of the light? Some kind of animal? Or something else entirely? All I know is that I never went back to the Appalachian Trail. And I never will. If you're thinking about hiking out there, be careful. It was just last year, 2023, and I thought I was in for a peaceful getaway. I'd been planning this trip to the Smoky Mountains for months. My name's Jason, I'm in my early 30s, and like many people, I work a desk job. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, deadlines, meetings, the usual work-life grind. So, when I found a long weekend in the fall, I figured I'd take a break from everything. A solo hike on the Appalachian Trail seemed like the perfect escape. No phones, no distractions, just me, the trees, and some fresh air. I had been to the Smoky Mountains a couple of times before, so I was familiar with the area. I parked my silver Subaru Outback near the Newfound Gap, a popular starting point for hikers. The weather was perfect, chilly in the morning, warming up as the sun climbed higher. I had packed all the usual essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map of the trail. I even grabbed my new pair of hiking boots I'd been dying to break in. Everything felt right. I set off, determined to clear my head. For the first few miles, everything went smoothly. The trail was bustling with other hikers, families, couples, some solo travelers just like me. We'd pass each other, exchange polite nods, maybe a few words about the weather or the beauty of the mountains. Nothing out of the ordinary. Around midday, the trail started to thin out. The higher I climbed, the fewer people I saw. It was around that point that I noticed something strange. There was this one guy I kept seeing every so often. He was wearing a faded red hoodie and dark jeans. At first, I thought it was just another hiker taking a break or going at his own pace, but something about the way he moved stuck with me. He was always just up ahead. Whenever I'd catch up, he'd disappear around a bend or go off the trail for a moment. I never actually saw him stop to rest, and I never heard him talk to anyone either. Just this strange, eerie presence. The weird part? I could swear I'd seen him multiple times in different spots along the trail, as though he was following me. And I wasn't just paranoid. I started to realize he was getting closer each time I turned around. The more I tried to shake the feeling, the more I couldn't shake him. By late afternoon, I reached a spot that was far from the main trail, a little overlook with a view of the mountains to the west. I took a seat on a large rock, hoping to enjoy some quiet before the sun went down. But as I sat there, trying to relax, I heard something. Footsteps. I turned my head to the left, expecting to see another hiker, but no one was there. The footsteps didn't stop. They were steady, almost rhythmic, like someone was walking in a slow, deliberate pattern. And then I saw him, the guy in the red hoodie, except this time he was standing right at the edge of the overlook, maybe 10 feet from where I was sitting. I could see his face now, and it was blank. His eyes were hollow, distant, and his face was pale. He didn't say a word, he just stared at me. I don't know why, but I didn't speak either. I couldn't. My throat felt dry and my heart was pounding in my chest. The world felt like it stopped moving for a second. It wasn't normal. There was nothing normal about the way he stood there, like he didn't belong in the world of living people. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps growing quieter as he disappeared into the trees. I sat frozen, trying to make sense of what just happened. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Maybe he had been there all along and I hadn't noticed until now. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence. I don't know how long I stayed there, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But as the sun started to dip lower, I realized it was time to head back. I gathered my stuff and started retracing my steps down the trail, my mind racing. I still hadn't seen anyone else for a while, and the more I walked, the more I felt that strange feeling that something was wrong. About 20 minutes later, I came to a clearing, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. The red hoodie. It was hanging from a branch of a tree about 30 feet off the trail. It was just there, blowing gently in the wind. I approached it cautiously, my heart beating faster with each step. I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational, that it wasn't a big deal. Maybe it was some lost gear, I told myself, but deep down, I knew something was terribly off. I reached out and grabbed the hoodie. The fabric was cold, and when I tugged it, I noticed something strange. There was a small piece of paper stuffed inside the pocket. I pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The message was written in messy, almost illegible handwriting. "Help! He's watching. Don't stay." I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood there, holding the hoodie in my hands, trying to make sense of it. But all I could think was, who wrote this? And why did they leave it behind? I didn't stick around to find out. I shoved the hoodie back onto the branch and started walking faster, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail for hours, but the deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt like I was being followed. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, it was almost dark. My Subaru was still parked in the same spot, and I quickly jumped to the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. I was shaking, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just overtired and freaked out by being alone in the woods. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching me. I'll never forget the image of that guy in the red hoodies standing there with that blank expression on his face. And I'll never forget the feeling I had when I found that message in the pocket. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I was just being paranoid or if something was really out there. But I don't think I'll ever go back to the Smoky Mountains. And if you're planning to hike the Appalachian Trail, especially alone, just be careful. Because some things out there don't want to be found. This happened last fall in 2023, and I still can't make sense of it. My name is Sarah, and I've been hiking for years. I've done the Appalachian Trail a few times, but I'd never been down to the North Carolina section before. I'd always heard how beautiful the section near the Nantahala Outdoor Center was, with the deep valleys and thick forests. So when I got the chance to take a break from work, I packed up my gear, drove my gray Honda CR-V down to North Carolina, and set off on a solo hike. I wasn't new to the trail, I knew the routine. You hike, you stop, you camp, and you keep going. Simple enough, right? But this trip turned out to be anything but simple. I got to the trailhead late in the afternoon, a little later than I had planned. The weather was perfect for hiking, crisp air, the kind that cuts through your jacket, but feels refreshing at the same time. I started on the trail near the Nantahala Gorge, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting everything in that golden afternoon light. I wasn't worried about making it too far that first day. The plan was to just set up camp before dark and enjoy the peace of the mountains. The trail here wasn't crowded, which I loved. I could hear the distant rushing of the river, the wind in the trees, and the occasional bird call, but mostly the quiet of the forest enveloped me. Around 6:30 p.m., I found a spot off the trail by a small stream, perfect for setting up camp. I didn't have a lot of gear with me. Just a basic tent, a sleeping bag, and my trusty old Coleman camp stove. I made a quick dinner, a freeze-dried meal that didn't taste like much, but did the job. After eating, I decided to build a small campfire, even though it wasn't really cold enough to need one. It's just part of the experience, right? I gathered some dry wood, set up the fire pit, and lit it. The flames crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the trees around me. I sat back, took a deep breath, and felt completely at peace. But that's when things started to feel off. The fire flickered a bit in the breeze, and for a moment it almost looked like someone was standing just outside the light. I blinked, but nothing. No one was there. Just the trees, the crackling of the fire, and the stillness. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks. I had been hiking for hours and I was getting tired, so I lay back against a log, staring up at the stars above. About half an hour later, I noticed something strange. The fire, well, it wasn't right. It wasn't going out, exactly, but it was almost like the flames were dimming, like the wood wasn't burning as hot anymore. I stood up, poked at the logs with a stick, and the flames flared back up for a second before dying down again. I added more wood, but the same thing kept happening. It felt like the fire was being smothered somehow. I was starting to get frustrated. I'd been camping enough to know how to start a fire, and I'd never seen anything like this before. That's when I heard it. A rustling from the trees, followed by a soft voice just barely above a whisper. "It's not safe to stay out here, you know." I froze. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart was thudding in my chest and my breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, scanning the woods around me, but I saw nothing. It was so dark now that I could barely make out shapes in the trees. "Who's there?" I finally called out, my voice shaky. Nothing. I waited for a response, my mind racing. Maybe it was another hiker, just messing with me. But I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear anyone approach. The voice, if you could even call it that, sounded too far away to be anyone nearby. I took a deep breath, tried to shake off the anxiety building in my chest, and turned back to the fire. But when I did, I noticed something terrifying. The fire was completely out. The wood was cold, blackened. There wasn't even a trace of embers. I couldn't understand it. I had just added logs to it. It didn't make sense. "Hello?" I called again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is anyone out there?" This time I heard the rustling again, but it wasn't just one voice. It was more like a murmuring, several voices, too soft to make out, but definitely there. They were surrounding me. I stood up quickly, grabbing my flashlight from my pack. I scanned the woods. Nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But I didn't want to panic. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and maybe a little freaked out from being alone in the woods. Maybe it was some weird animal making noises, I told myself. But then I saw movement in the trees. Just a flash, but it was enough to send me into overdrive. I grabbed my pack, shoved my stuff into it without even properly packing, and started toward the trail. I didn't care if it was dark. I didn't care if I had to hike in the dark all night. I just wanted to get away. But as I walked down the trail, I realized something. It wasn't just that the fire had gone out, it was the air. It had changed. It felt wrong. It felt like something was pressing in around me. My flashlight flickered a few times, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I was sure I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I kept walking, fast, almost running, until I couldn't hear the rustling anymore. I don't know how far I went, but I eventually found a spot on the trail where I felt safe enough to stop. I couldn't get the voice out of my head, though. The warning, the whispers, and the feeling of something following me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, huddled against a rock, listening to every sound in the dark. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, I packed up and left without looking back. I didn't even take time to enjoy the views. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but that night has haunted me since. The voices, the fire going out, the feeling of being watched, it didn't feel like just an odd experience. It felt like something was warning me to leave. And if I had stayed, I have no idea what could have happened. So if you're thinking of hiking the Appalachian Trail, especially around the Nantahala area, just be careful. Some things in those woods don't want you to stick around. And whatever you do, don't stay after dark. It was the summer of 2022 when I first heard the story. Blood Mountain in northern Georgia is one of the most popular spots along the Appalachian Trail. People love it for the stunning views, the rugged terrain, and the rich history. But there's a darker side to it. A story about a hiker who went missing there, one that still gives me chills every time I think about it. Title: 10 Scary Appalachian Trail Horror Stories. Story 4: The Missing Hiker of Blood Mountain. It was the summer of 2022 when I first heard the story. Blood Mountain in northern Georgia is one of the most popular spots along the Appalachian Trail. People love it for the stunning views, the rugged terrain, and the rich history. But there's a darker side to it. A story about a hiker who went missing there, one that still gives me chills every time I think about it. I wasn't there when it happened, but my friend Kevin was. Kevin's a seasoned hiker, the kind of guy who lives for weekends on the trail. He's seen his fair share of odd things in the woods, but this was different. He told me what happened, and I'll never forget the fear in his voice.
It started on a Saturday morning in July. Kevin had planned a weekend hike on the Appalachian Trail,
Starting at Neal's Gap and heading up to Blood Mountain. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. He packed his usual gear, his Osprey backpack, a hydration bladder, snacks, and a first aid kit. Kevin isn't the kind of guy to take risks. He's methodical, always prepared. At the trailhead, he met a guy named Tim. Tim was in his late 20s with a scruffy beard and an old red bandana tied around his head. He had a huge pack, almost comically large, and an easygoing smile that made him instantly likable. They got to talking as they set off, and it turned out Tim was hiking solo too. They decided to stick together for the climb. Kevin described Tim as one of those people who seemed to have endless energy. He'd crack jokes, point out little details along the trail, like a bird's nest high in a tree or an odd-shaped rock. Kevin appreciated the company. Hiking solo can get lonely, even for someone as experienced as him. By the time they reached the summit of Blood Mountain, it was late afternoon. The view was breathtaking, the kind of sight that makes you forget about everything else. The sprawling forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, the peaks of other mountains rising like waves in the distance. They sat down to eat and rest, talking about everything from hiking gear to their favorite horror movies. Tim mentioned he was a fan of Stephen King and laughed about how his love for the genre probably wasn't the best thing for a guy who spent so much time alone in the woods. It was almost sunset when Tim decided he wanted to explore a bit more before heading back down. Kevin was tired and wanted to stay at the summit a bit longer, so they agreed to meet back at the shelter near the trail junction. Tim grabbed his pack, waved, and disappeared into the trees. That was the last time Kevin saw him. Kevin waited at the shelter for hours, his unease growing with every passing minute. It wasn't like Tim to just vanish. He had seemed like a confident, experienced hiker. By the time night fell, Kevin's worry had turned into fear. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Tim had decided to camp further along the trail, or maybe he'd taken a wrong turn and would show up in the morning. But deep down, Kevin knew something was wrong. The night in the shelter was one of the longest of Kevin's life. He barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities. He thought about searching for Tim in the dark, but knew it would be dangerous. Blood Mountain is rugged, with steep drop-offs and dense underbrush. If Tim had gotten lost, Kevin wouldn't help anyone by becoming lost himself. At first light, Kevin set out to look for him. He retraced the trail they had taken, calling Tim's name every few minutes. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He found no sign of Tim, no tracks, no discarded gear, nothing. By midday, Kevin decided to hike back to the parking lot and notify the park rangers. They organized a search party immediately, and Kevin joined them, hoping against hope that they'd find Tim safe and sound. The team combed the area for hours, calling out his name, searching every trail, every ridge, every hollow. Nothing. Tim was gone. The official search lasted 3 days. The rangers brought in dogs, drones, even a helicopter. They interviewed other hikers on the trail, checked shelters, and scoured every inch of the surrounding wilderness. But it was as if Tim had simply vanished into thin air. His name was added to the list of missing persons on the Appalachian Trail, a list that's longer than most people realize. Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that something unnatural had happened. He told me that when the Rangers finally called off the search, he went back to the summit of Blood Mountain alone, desperate for some kind of closure. What he found still haunts him. There's a boulder near the summit, one that hikers often use as a marker to know they've reached the top. Kevin found something carved into it. Fresh, jagged letters that hadn't been there before. It's watching. Kevin said the carving looked frantic, as if someone had done it in a hurry. The edges of the letters were uneven, and the words seemed almost shaky, like the person who carved them was terrified. He felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the message, his mind racing with possibilities. He searched the area around the boulder, calling out Tim's name one last time. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the forest. When Kevin left that day, he said he felt like something was watching him. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but he felt it. An undeniable sense of being observed followed. He didn't run, didn't want to provoke whatever might have been out there. He just walked, as calmly as he could, all the way back to his car.
Tim was never found. His disappearance remains a mystery.
One that Kevin can't stop thinking about. He told me he hasn't been back to Blood Mountain since, and I don't blame him. Something about that place, it's not right. People still hike there every year, drawn by the beauty and the challenge of the trail. Most of them have a great time, completely unaware of the darker stories that surround the mountain. But some, like Tim, don't come back. If you ever decide to hike Blood Mountain, remember this. Stick to the trail, don't wander off, and if you see something you can't explain, don't ignore it. It was 1994, and I was 19 years old, fresh out of high school. Back then, the world felt wide open, and the Appalachian Trail was my escape. I didn't have much. A beat-up Ford Ranger, a tent I borrowed from my uncle, and a cheap pair of hiking boots I picked up at the local Kmart in Johnson City, Tennessee. But I had the energy and curiosity of someone who thought nothing could touch them. That year, I decided to hike a section of the trail through the Laurel Fork Wilderness in Tennessee, just for a weekend. The area was beautiful. Thick woods, rolling hills, and the kind of quiet that makes you feel small in the best way. I started out early on a Friday morning, leaving my Ranger parked near the Dennis Cove trailhead. My plan was to hike a few miles in, camp overnight, and hike back out on Sunday. Simple, peaceful, perfect. The first day was uneventful, just me, the trail, and the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. I passed a couple of other hikers, a middle-aged couple who smiled and waved, and a guy about my age wearing a Nirvana t-shirt. Nothing weird, nothing unusual. By the time the sun started setting, I found a clearing near the Laurel Fork Creek to set up camp. I built a small fire, made some instant ramen, and settled in for the night. But the next morning, that's when things got strange. I was about 5 miles into the day's hike when I noticed something odd. The trail curved sharply around a dense cluster of mountain laurel bushes, their twisted branches forming a natural tunnel over the path. The air here felt different, cooler, heavier, like the sun wasn't quite able to reach through the canopy. As I rounded the bend, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a pile of sticks tangled in the laurel, but as I got closer, my stomach turned. It wasn't sticks, it was limbs. Human limbs. There was an arm, pale and lifeless, draped over the twisted branches. The hand was half closed, the fingernails caked with dirt. A leg lay nearby, bent at an unnatural angle, the hiking boot still on the foot. I froze. My heart was racing, and my brain was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone dumped a body here? I took a step closer, my breath shaky. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The limbs weren't bloody. They weren't fresh. They looked old, like they'd been out here for weeks, maybe months. But they didn't smell like you'd expect. There was no rot, no stench. It was like they had been preserved somehow, just sitting there in the laurel as if waiting to be found. I didn't stick around to investigate. I turned and bolted back down the trail, my pack bouncing against my back. My mind was racing. Should I head back to the trailhead and find a ranger? Was this even real? I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way. When I got back to the parking lot, my truck was the only vehicle there. I threw my gear into the bed and sped off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I drove straight to the Carter County Sheriff's Office, my heart pounding the entire way. When I burst into the station, the deputy at the desk looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I stammered out what I'd seen, describing the limbs, the laurel bushes, everything. The more I talked, the more his expression changed, from skepticism to concern. "We'll send someone out there," he said, scribbling notes on a pad. "Can you show us exactly where you saw them?" I agreed to go back with them, though the thought of returning to that spot made my stomach churn. 2 deputies and I drove back to the trailhead in their cruiser, the radio crackling with static as we wound our way through the narrow mountain roads. By the time we got to the spot, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. I led them to the bend in the trail, my nerves on edge. But when we got there, the limbs were gone. I swear, they were right there. But the laurel bushes looked undisturbed, like nothing had ever been there. The deputies searched the area, poking around the underbrush with their flashlights, but they didn't find anything. No limbs, no blood, nothing. "You sure this is the spot?" one of them asked, his voice laced with doubt. I nodded, my frustration and confusion mounting. "I know what I saw," I insisted. The deputies exchanged glances, but didn't push it. They told me they'd file a report and keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I left the trail that evening feeling shaken and humiliated, but I knew I wasn't crazy. I had seen those limbs. They were real. A week later, my story made the local news. The sheriff's office issued a statement saying they hadn't found any evidence of foul play in the area, but other hikers started coming forward with strange stories. Some claimed they'd seen shadows moving in the laurel or heard whispers when no one was around. One guy even reported finding an old, weathered shoe with no sign of its owner. The story faded from the news after a while, but it never left me. I still think about those limbs, about the way they looked so out of place yet so real. Were they a warning? A remnant of something terrible that happened on that trail? I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been back to the Laurel Fork Wilderness since. It was 2008, and I was a sophomore at the University of Tennessee. My friends and I had been talking about it for months, a weekend getaway hiking on the Appalachian Trail. The idea was simple: escape the stress of finals, grab our gear, and spend a couple of days getting lost in nature. No phones, no distractions, just us and the wild. There were 4 of us, me. Title: 10 Scary Appalachian Trail Horror Stories. Story 6: The Wild Encounter of 2008. It was 2008, and I was a sophomore at the University of Tennessee. My friends and I had been talking about it for months, a weekend getaway hiking on the Appalachian Trail. The idea was simple: escape the stress of finals, grab our gear, and spend a couple of days getting lost in nature. No phones, no distractions, just us and the wild. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Claire, her boyfriend Matt, and our buddy Jason. We had all hiked before, but this was our first time on the Appalachian Trail, and we were excited. We picked a section near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, just north of Gatlinburg. We had a loose plan to hike the trail for a couple of days, camp under the stars, and then head back to school. Simple enough, right? We started early on a Friday morning, packing our gear into Jason's beat-up Honda Civic. We drove out of Knoxville, blasting music and making jokes, the air full of that excited energy you only get when you're about to do something new and adventurous. We reached the trailhead by midday, parked at Newfound Gap, and set off on the trail with our backpacks, all packed with just the essentials: food, water, and the usual hiking gear. Everything seemed fine at first. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool with a breeze that kept us from getting too hot. We hiked for hours, chatting, laughing, and taking in the beauty of the mountains. We stopped at a few scenic overlooks and took a ton of photos. our spirits high as we made our way deeper into the woods. By the time we decided to set up camp, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. We found a small clearing near a stream, and the first thing we did was get the fire going. Claire pulled out a bag of marshmallows, Matt cracked open a couple of beers he had smuggled in his bag, and Jason started making his famous campfire chili. Everything felt perfect. Just a group of friends, laughing around a fire, nothing to worry about. But that's when it all started to change. We had just finished dinner when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It was faint at first, like someone walking a little too quietly, trying to sneak up without being noticed. Everyone froze, their eyes snapping to the trees around us. "What was that?" Matt whispered, his voice tight. "Probably a deer or something," I said, trying to shake off the sudden unease creeping up my spine. But I wasn't so sure. We all stood up, staring into the darkening woods. The rustling continued, but this time it was closer. Too close. Something wasn't right. Jason grabbed a flashlight from his pack and pointed it toward the sound. The beam sliced through the trees, illuminating nothing but the shadows of branches swaying in the wind. But then we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the light. At first we all thought it was a deer, but as the creature stepped into the light, we realized it was much larger. It was a bear. A bear. A big one. Way bigger than anything we'd seen in the zoo or even on nature documentaries. It stood about 10 feet away, its eyes locked on us. It wasn't moving, just staring, like it was deciding whether we were worth its time. We all froze, my heart racing in my chest. Bears don't normally attack unless they're provoked, but you never know, especially in the wild. Claire was the first to speak. Should we back away slowly?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jason, the most experienced of us, nodded. "Yeah, we don't want to make any sudden moves. Just stay calm and back away." We slowly started to gather our things, our bags, the food, the tent. Moving as quietly as possible, our eyes never leaving the bear. It stayed in place, watching us, its massive form a dark silhouette in the beam of the flashlight. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Out of nowhere, we heard another rustling, this time from behind us. The sound was closer, and this time, we all knew what it was. Another bear. A second one. Before we could react, we heard a growl, and the second bear appeared from the trees, stepping into the clearing. It was smaller than the first, but still huge, and now we were surrounded. There was no way out without risking a confrontation. We were trapped between two bears, both eyeing us like we were prey. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind was racing. What do we do? What if they charge? Jason, who had been taking point, calmly whispered, "Stay calm. Don't run. Don't make eye contact." The bears were close enough now that I could hear their breathing. It was slow, steady, like they were sizing us up, trying to decide how much of a threat we were. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. This was real. This was happening. Just as I thought we were done for, Matt, who had been trying to back away, tripped over a rock. He fell hard, the sound of his body hitting the ground echoing through the clearing. The noise startled the bears. For a brief moment, they both looked toward him, and that's when we made our move. "Run!" Jason yelled. And without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the trail. I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps thudding on the ground. My legs burned as I sprinted, not daring to look back. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like forever, but eventually we stumbled into an open space. We stopped to catch our breath, completely exhausted, our bodies shaking from the fear and the sprint. We didn't stop to camp again that night. We hiked for hours, finally finding a ranger station at dawn. We reported the incident to the rangers, and they took down our story, assuring us that they would investigate. They mentioned that bear sightings were becoming more frequent in the area and that hikers needed to be extra cautious. The next day, our encounter made the local news. The rangers had sent out a warning about bear activity in the area, and our story was part of the report. It turned out that the bears we had encountered were likely drawn to the area by the scent of food, and the situation could have turned deadly if we hadn't been lucky. For weeks after, my friends and I couldn't stop talking about it. We laughed about the experience, trying to downplay the fear we felt, but deep down, we all knew we had come closer to something dangerous than we were ready for. That was the last time I ever camped in that part of the Appalachian Trail. I still love hiking, but I've got a lot more respect for the wildlife out there now. And if you're planning a trip to the Smokies or anywhere along the Appalachian Trail, remember this. Wild animals are not cute little creatures from nature documentaries. They're unpredictable, and you never know when you'll have a real run-in with them. It's the kind of story that sticks with you, especially if you've ever taken your family into the woods. I'm not sure how or why it happened, but after hearing about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes the woods are better left alone. It was a typical summer day in the Great Smoky Mountains, warm, sunny, and ideal for a family hike. Or at least that's what Jessica thought when she decided to take her two young kids, Ethan and Lily, out for a weekend trip along the Appalachian Trail. Jessica was a mom in her early 30s, just trying to do something fun for her kids while they were out of school. She had always been an outdoorsy person, grew up camping, hiking, all that, but she'd never taken the kids on a longer hike. She figured it was time. After all, how hard could a day hike on the Appalachian Trail be, especially in such a well-traveled area near Cades Cove? She packed the car with the usual: snacks, water, sunscreen, a couple of sandwiches, and a first aid kit. Ethan was 8 and Lily was 6, both eager and excited for the adventure. They were typical kids, full of energy, ready to explore. Jessica, on the other hand, felt confident but a little overwhelmed. She didn't realize that taking a family into the Smokies on a busy weekend could be so risky. The day started off great. They parked at the trailhead, the sun was shining, and there were a couple of other families around, so it didn't feel like they were alone. The trail was easy enough for a family with kids, a manageable 4-mile stretch of the Appalachian Trail that went through a mix of forest and a couple of scenic viewpoints. Jessica figured they'd make it to the overlook, have lunch, and then turn back before the kids got too tired. Simple. At first, the hike was fun. Ethan and Lily ran ahead, their laughter echoing in the trees. Jessica took her time, reminding them to stay close, but she was too distracted. She didn't realize how quickly the forest could change its mood. One minute, it was all bright sunlight and chirping birds. The next, the forest seemed darker, quieter. Jessica started to feel uneasy, but she brushed it off. The kids were fine. Everything seemed normal, so she kept moving. But as they went deeper into the woods, something felt wrong. It started with the silence. Suddenly, the usual forest noises, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, stopped. Jessica thought it was odd, but she didn't think too much about it. The kids were still running ahead, giggling, unaware of the shift in the air. But as she caught up with them, she noticed something even stranger. The trail, which had been well marked, started to narrow. The path twisted and turned in ways that didn't feel right. It was as if the woods were swallowing them whole. "Hey, we should turn back," Jessica called to the kids, trying to sound casual, but there was a hint of panic in her voice. But it was too late. Ethan and Lily had already wandered off the path, playing near the base of a large tree. When Jessica caught up, she saw the look on their faces. Their smiles frozen, eyes wide. They weren't playing anymore. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." Jessica turned to where he was pointing, and her blood ran cold. The woods ahead of them seemed different, darker somehow, even though it was still midday. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the trees had grown thick overhead. But then she saw something that made her stomach drop. A figure standing between the trees, watching them. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch out of the shadows. It was pale, almost ghostly, with dark, hollow eyes that glimmered as they caught the sunlight. Jessica felt a chill run through her head, but she tried to stay calm, telling herself it was just another hiker, or maybe even someone else's imagination. But then the figure stepped forward. "Mom, what is that?" Lily asked, her voice high-pitched with fear. Jessica's heart raced. She knew they needed to leave. She didn't even think about what was standing there anymore. She just grabbed the kids' hands and started pulling them down the trail, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Come on, kids, let's go." "Now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but it cracked. They started to walk faster, but the air felt heavy, like the forest was holding them in place. Every step was harder than the last. She turned around only to find the figure wasn't there anymore. It was gone. But they weren't alone. Jessica's panic skyrocketed. She turned back to the kids, but they were looking behind her now, their faces pale. "I see it, too," Ethan whispered. "It's right there, Mom." Before Jessica could react, there was a sound, something like a snap, a twig breaking. She spun around to find a shape moving through the trees, following them, always just out of sight. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in the forest. The feeling of being hunted settled over them. Jessica started to run, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stay with me," she shouted, but her feet felt like lead, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. The forest was closing in around them. It was suffocating. She couldn't see where she was going, couldn't see anything but the thick trees and the oppressive silence. The kids were crying now, and Jessica could hear their footsteps pounding behind her. They ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Finally, she spotted the trailhead again in the distance. It wasn't far, but it felt like a lifetime away. Her legs were on fire, and she didn't dare stop. When they finally made it to the parking lot, Jessica collapsed to the ground, her breath ragged, the kids huddling against her, still sobbing. She looked around frantically, but the woods were empty, still. Whatever had been following them was gone. Jessica never spoke about it again. She took her kids straight home, packed up their things, and didn't look back. They didn't hike again for years. But the story made the local news a few days later. A family had gone missing in the Smoky Mountains, only to be found hours later, disoriented and terrified, with no memory of what had happened. The police couldn't explain it, and neither could the hikers. They claimed they had encountered something in the woods, something that didn't belong. That's the thing about hiking on the Appalachian Trail. The forest can be beautiful, peaceful, but it can also be deceptive. Some things don't want to be found, and some paths should never be taken.